following. I quit snolas, and the city ama, Domino, quit Savoya, Islavotian, the name of Onsabo, Islavotian. Heitzepka to know, Quanelmo to the Tummel. Greetings to our honored guests and my dear ones. I have the feelings in my heart to see all of you. And in our Coast way, I told you my name, Leah George Wilson. I'm the daughter of Dee and Hereditary Chief Ernie George. I'm the granddaughter of late Lillian and late Hereditary Chief John L. George. Thanking the people of this land for having us all here this evening. And I'd like to say thank you to the Metlakatla Land Code Committee for inviting me to this session as well as to the earlier session in the village. It's totally my pleasure and honor to join you this evening. And some of you may be on Facebook. Then we need to be friends because you're going to be on my Facebook. Hold on. I'd like everybody to know where I am and what I'm doing. Social media can be used for so many different things. I like to use mine to let people know where I'm at and what I'm doing and what's important and what else is going on in the world. I'm from the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation. I'm on the Land Advisory Board. I've been on the board since 2008. In fact, Deanna Hamilton told me I was the first female to be elected onto that board. One of my other good friends, Wendy John, used to tell me, even if as a woman we're outnumbered at the table, if there was 4 men and there was only one, and you're the only woman, she would say, it only takes one. So I think that's true in a lot of our communities because it's women that are the backbone of a lot of the things that we do in our communities. My community is a couple miles east of Iron Workers Memorial in North Vancouver, just towards Deep Cove, if you're familiar at all with that area. We're a really small community. We have probably about 500 members, probably maybe 300 live on reserve. We took 2 years, like you, in the land code process. We had quite a large land code committee. It was like 18 or 20 of them. Sometime I actually was part of that committee because I worked in treaty lands and resources. And they made it that large because the chief at the time was using it as a teaching tool to help teach young people who are in their 20s how to chair meetings and how to behave in meetings and how to take notes and that kind of thing. So right away, Land Code was actually helping to build capacity in our community. A couple of those young people are now working, well, they went on to university and now they're working in our administration. We had, with that large committee, everybody on the committee could answer questions regarding the land code. And when we had community meetings or information sessions, such as this one, the people who worked in the lands department weren't the ones that were giving the information or talking about what was important or asking the questions. It was the community members, and that really helped build capacity in the community as well and let people know that you're going to be heard in this process. And it wasn't the council doing what the council wanted to do, and it wasn't the ECDAV doing what ECDAV does. It was the community driving that process. And there was a real fear in the community that, because at one time, we had a council that it felt like, it wasn't true, but it felt like to some people that they were doing what they wanted to do. And we would tell people that the way to limit what your council is or isn't doing is through this land code, but in particular through the things that you're going to do in economic development, including, for example, in our community, we have you call townhouses on leased land. So they're leased for 99 years and comes to welcome in and they buy and they live there. But we wanted to make sure that, they were set back from the stream, that all the trees weren't cut down, and that if there was something that needed to be protected within the environment, that it would be, because that's, as as First Nations people, that's what's important to us. So our land code held things that are important to us. And when we started to make laws, we would make laws about things that are important to us that we wanted to protect, not about what economic development wanted. Did I tell you we had like 92% of the people who voted for our land code voted yes? So we had this really incredible amount of turnout and positive turnout in our community. It made the community feel good that we were getting out from at least a portion of the internet. It's been a good experience for our community, where we, like you, are in the treaty process. That's a whole nother meeting, by the way. But having said that, whenever we get to a final agreement, it doesn't matter when it is, we've already got this sectoral self-government piece around land, and we're making laws around land. So when we get to the final agreement piece, we will already have land laws that we can use within our final agreement. And we know that this is true because Chawasan First Nation had a land code, and now they have a final agreement, as well as the latest one, Cheyenne and Slayan, just ratified in April last year. So in my humble opinion, the land code is what will help you build capacity in your community and in your administration. It helps our people understand and be able to do the administrative side of land governance within our community without having to be, up here, you're far away from Vancouver. For us, that's across the water, but for here, it's different. It's better for you to have all of these abilities and tools in your toolbox here in your community. I think all in all, it's been a good experience for our community, and being part of the Land Advisory Board has been a great experience for me. It got me up here to Metlakatla, and I got to see your home, your community village, which is beautiful. And I get to meet beautiful people like you and help communities take down some authority from the federal government and take care of your land in the way that's important to all of you, and not to somebody in Vancouver or in Ottawa. I think I'll be turning the mic back over to Clarence, who will bring us over to Rob, and I'll be back for the question period, and please ask Rob all the questions.
Thank you. Forgive me, I just made a movie here. I forgot to introduce the committee, which we have guests here to get to know who's on the committee, the Land Code Committee. We'll start with the top man. There's Phil, who's Director of Lands. Phil. And of course on the table we have Kisa, who's clerk in Metlakatla in the office over there. And we have, it's too bad, it's been a long day here today. We have Lindsay. Lindsay didn't make it over to Bill's today. Lindsay's one of the committee members. Thanks for coming out tonight, Lindsay. And Christy. Where's Christy out here? She's over there. She's a committee member. Alria Leask. She's a committee member. Fanny Nelson. to be a member and provide the food for us over in Metlakatla today. Of course, we have Patty right in the corner. I always say we'll answer all the questions you ask. And we also had other people in the community that are involved in treaty and whatnot. Joseph Leask, he's a technical person who advises us, as well as other people in the office there. Charlie Carly. Charlie didn't make it here tonight. He was on a long drive. I guess he was 18 hours coming down from his territory, and he didn't make it here tonight. Thought he was going to make it. In our communications man, Sean here, who is head of communication, does a good job in getting that information out to the membership. In fact, I guess we're online now, hey Sean? And then we have, who else? Who's on the camera here? Nikita is doing the camera work. So that's who's all involved in the land code in Metlakatla now, and we're looking forward to next week to see which direction the vote's going to go. And after you hear our next speaker talk, I'm sure he'll convince you how important it is to have a yes vote. So could I have Chief Robert Lee up here? And after he's finished, then we'll have question period. And between him and Leah, they'll answer the questions. And but listen very carefully. You know, we've learned so much from District Robert Lee's presentation today, and because he's been involved in this process since day one. So welcome again, Chief.
Thank you, Limlin, in our language. Thank you, Clarence, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, peoples of Metlakatla, to the Tsimshian peoples. I'm honored to be here. So, Wai Slap. Hello and good evening. Incha Iskwi Simu. My Okanagan Silk's name is Simu. It means connected to the lands. It was given to me by my grandmother. I'm very proud to carry that name. It's a very old traditional name in the Okanagan Silks culture, and my ancestry goes back thousands of years like yours. I'm very proud to be associated with the lands management and the lands work that I do across Canada. And I say, Limna, thank you for inviting me here tonight to your beautiful, beautiful lands. I wish to thank Alrita for the opening prayer. And I certainly give thanks to the Chief and Council, to the Lands Committee, to all of you for all of the hard work and for your dedication to have the will to look after your lands, to take control of your lands. I also give thanks to your ancestors who have protected your lands, protected your resources. I certainly hold my hands up high to your ancestors, and I know you're proud of your ancestors, and you rightfully should be. So my respects to your ancestors and to the peoples of these lands. Having the opportunity to be here gives me a real appreciation as to what some of the most beautiful lands in the world are. You certainly have them here. The resources, the natural beauty, the pristineness that you have is second to none. And I congratulate you and your peoples and all your nation for having such a beautiful place and looking after these pristine lands all these thousands of years. I know you have, I think there's a live feed here to people out of town in Vancouver and places like that. I wish them all the well and all the best, and hopefully the presentation now I'm going to give with regard to lands and the management of lands and this land code process will be beneficial and hopefully give you a better understanding as to what you need to consider if you have not yet cast your vote for the land code that you have proposed. Having said that, I would like to perhaps give you more of a background. Myself, I'm no longer the elected chief. I served for my community up until September 15th. I've served for over 24 years, in my community as a chief. I was elected councillor in 1974, so I go back in politics quite a long ways. My professional background is legal. I practice law in the town of Vernon. Graduated in 1982, practiced, and went on to become chief, and that changed my whole career. So I went from a legal one to a political one. And I'm very pleased for that. I'm very pleased that I've been able to contribute to First Nations across Canada, particularly as it concerns the land code and the management of lands. I've been involved since its inception, and to give you the history, the background as to why the land code and the framework agreement process started, I have to go back to my community. I was first elected, as I said, chief in 1986 at the West Bank First Nation. West Bank First Nation is in the heart of the Okanagan Valley. We're about an hour and 40 minutes from the U.S. border. We have about 69,000 square kilometers that falls within the Okanagan Silks territory, and we represent the part of the Okanagan Silks territory as far as British Columbia goes. Our territory stretches into Washington State, where the Colville Confederated Tribes are our cousins and people connected with who we are as the Okanagan Silks. In 1986, just after my election in August of that year, and just prior to that, our community was going through quite deliberations. There was lots of issues concerning the council of the day prior to my taking office, and the Indian Affairs got involved. They got involved, they demanded and called a public inquiry into the affairs of West Bank, then called Indian Band. And that started a whole process, because no sooner did myself and the elected council of the day took office, they chose to revoke the land management authorities that we had developed and worked with for quite a number of years through the Indian Act. Section 53 and Section 60. Those are two significant sections if you consider lands management under the Indian Act. Now, even though they revoked those powers, I want to make it very clear, those powers under the Indian Act are subsidiary to lawmaking. Any First Nation that has these authorities under the Indian Act are delegates of the Crown. That is, there is a decision maker above them. The Minister, Department of Indian Affairs, makes the final decisions. What we're talking about here tonight and about the land code is something totally different. And I'll get into that in a moment so that you hopefully have a better understanding as to the importance of what you're considering right now. But during that process, when the Department of Indian Affairs revoked our Section 53 and Section 60 powers, or authorities, if you will, the first task I had was of the day as a newly elected chief was to take it to our community, which I did. And we had a huge turnout, perhaps one of the largest turnouts that our community's ever seen. We had almost 100%, if not 100%, of all of the voters on WFN lands come out to that meeting. We discussed it that evening. At the end of the evening, the vote was cast. What do we do with this revocation of our land management authorities? It was very clear from that discussion and the vote, 100% support was to sue the Department of Indian Affairs, sue the federal government, which we did. We were involved in a lawsuit with the federal government for a couple of years. And it was just coming up to the next election. At that time, we had a 2-year term. Today it's 3 years. At that time, 2 years. And my term was coming to an end, and we were going through the court process. We had gone through the examination for discoveries. Everything was set. We were basically on the court steps, basically within a week or so of going into trial. At my office, I received a telephone call from the Department of Indian Affairs saying, "Chief Louis, we would like to propose a settlement with you." And all right, I'm all ears. What is it? We will return these land management authorities to you, and we will do that immediately. So I said, all right, pay the legal fees, pay our costs, and let's talk, which they did. During that process, though, they said, Chief Louis, we're working on lands, revenues, and trusts. This is a national thing. They started in the early 1980s, And there was problems, as you can appreciate, with the Indian Act, with land management. So they asked me to take charge and make recommendations back to the department as to how lands, revenues, and trusts could be improved. What do they do with the land management sections? What is something that could be seen as more fair for First Nations across Canada? So I took up the challenge. I asked for monies to allow us to meet with chiefs across Canada, which I did. There were 9 First Nations with this delegated land management authority of the Indian Act. We met in British Columbia, we met in the prairies, we met in the eastern provinces. Collectively, we all agreed that we were all being treated differently under the Indian Act. It was by policy. Each regional district treated us differently. There was no rhyme or reason for it. They had cut back the funding. There wasn't sufficient dollars being put on the table to cover the costs of land managers, of costs necessary to handle leasehold interests and matters related to land management. So our task was to find ways to improve it, which we did. We worked for several years. We came up with a funding formula. We backed it up, and were able to prove that these are the costs associated with the management of lands. And we were successful to convince the Department of Indian Affairs it had to put adequate money on the table. So that was the first challenge. The second challenge was, do we proceed further as an amendment of the Indian Act with lands, revenues, and trusts, or do we do something different? And I started originally with this group of chiefs. We had 14 First Nations that were involved, including my community at West Bay. We started down the path much similar to what then Chief Manny Jules was doing with his taxation amendment. The minister of the day, with Chief Manny Jules of the day, asked him to get 75 band council resolutions in support of taxation as a concept, which he was able to do. And that's what you see today with the property taxation regime that's in place now across Canada with First Nations. The minister of the day, Tom Siddon, Conservative minister, asked me to do the same thing. So we started down that path only very briefly, and it became very clear as we started down that path, is this something that we really want? Do we want an amendment to the Indian Act? It became very clear after discussions with the chiefs across the country, communities, we said no, that's not what we want. It's not what First Nations are all about. Those of you who know the Constitution know that it was amended in 1982. And it's a significant amendment when you deal with sections of that Constitution. In those sections that pertain to First Nations, they indicated that the inherent rights of First Nations are going to be recognized. Aboriginal title was a concept that was brought forward, and it's something that set the tone for future court cases. Now we've got the Supreme Court of Canada cases, and Aboriginal title has now been shown to prove that exists in Canada, particularly British Columbia. It's still being worked on. So as we went through that, we knew that we had to be recognized as self-governing, the inherent right to manage our own affairs. The then government of the day was Conservatives. They were challenged by the Liberals of the day. And during that process, the Liberal government campaigned on the promise to First Nations in their Red Book policy that they would recognize the inherent rights of First Nation peoples. They didn't say how, they didn't say when it was going to happen, but that was a very clear statement that was put forward as they were campaigning to come to power. They subsequently became the government of the day under Khrushchev. The minister was then a person that we wanted to deal with, because our chiefs, myself included, put a proposal to the new Liberal government saying, you campaigned that you would recognize inherent rights of us as First Nation peoples. You haven't done it, you haven't put together a plan, but we have a plan. And this is our proposal. We said that the first thing that has to be done, something of significant value has to be shown. And that significance has to be that you have to recognize our inherent rights to be the decision makers over our lands. We needed the authority to pass laws That's how inherent rights have to be recognized. And we argued with them, and we got the concurrence of the then Liberal government. We signed a framework agreement on First Nation land management on February 12, 1996 at Georgina Island, Ontario. That is a significant document. It forms the basis of subsequent legislation that was passed by the Parliament of Canada. That framework agreement recognizes us as equal partners, as government-to-government groups. First Nations being recognized as governments, number one. First Nations being recognized with the inherent right to manage their own lands. That lands are not going to be sold as reserve lands. That we were going to have the right to do as we saw fit to manage our own lands. That was the premise. The whole thing that no Department of Indian Affairs minister, no Prime Minister, no provincial government, no Department of Indian Affairs personnel was going to make our decisions. Very, very significant advancement. The subsequent legislation was passed in Parliament federally in June of 1999. One of the conditions of that passage to implement it was that we, as First Nations, needed 2 First Nations that would pass land codes. We were successful. At the turn of the millennium, when the clock struck midnight to start the new 1,000 year, the year 2000, we had 3 First Nations that passed their land codes. The Mississaugas of Scugog Island, Chippewas of Georgina Island, and Muscogee First Nation. 2 of them, both Georgina Island and Scugog Island, were in Ontario. The third was Muscogee in Saskatchewan. They took the land management jurisdiction at the stroke of midnight, and they set history into motion. Today, we have 64 First Nations that have actually passed land codes today. Today, we have 47 in the developmental process that are now in the midst of proceeding with land code development, and that includes your community here at Metlakatla. In total, we have 189 First Nations either involved directly or indirectly. We have on the wait list now quite a number of First Nations that also are standing by, waiting their turn. A total of 189. That's more than 1 out of 4 First Nations out of 333 First Nations in Canada who are either involved or want to be involved. And the numbers are growing significantly. Very significant. Is this a good thing? Yes. There is no question. I am so honored to be able to work with the chiefs and the communities of all the jobs that I've had. And I've had some pretty significant jobs. I've been involved in quite a number of things. Perhaps the proudest that I've been is to work on land management, to work and to secure federal legislation that recognizes our inherent rights to manage our own lands and our resources. It's huge. The late Chief Joe Mathias from Squamish basically said before he passed away that, very simply, that this may be the most significant thing that's happened to First Nations people in the history of Canada. And that was the right and the inherent right to manage their own lands, to be the decision makers over their own lands. And he was absolutely correct in that statement. So this is what we've been able to accomplish. I've been proud to be involved. I've been involved in meetings across Canada. I've met First Nations from coast to coast. Literally, I've been involved in thousands of meetings from day one on land management. I've had to defend this. I've worked very hard, day after day, week after week, month after month, to secure legislation. And we met with the parliamentarians of the day, with not only the government leaders, but the opposition leaders, and those associated with government, with municipal governments, with the Native Women's Society, with the Assembly of First Nations, with treaty groups, with First Nation groups in pretty much every province across. They said, stop these native peoples, you Indians, stop them until we have this agreement, so we know we have something secure, and then allow them to have the self-government that they're seeking. And we fought that, but we won. We prevailed. We were able to convince the parliamentarians. I was involved in that, and I did many submissions with a number of other chiefs across this Canada, both at the parliamentary committee levels, within the Indian Affairs Parliamentary Committee, at Senate, and with numerous groups, but we prevailed. We were successful. It was unfair of any municipal or regional government, any provincial government, to stop us to being recognized with inherent rights to manage our own affairs. That's very, very significant. I can't explain, perhaps, the importance of what that means. Our framework agreement contains certain principles, and those principles recognize us, as I mentioned, as government to government. It recognizes that we have the inherent right to manage our own lands and resources, our own affairs. And it says and outlines very clearly that the federal government has a continued fiduciary obligation to look after us, to provide funding, to allow us to be able to properly manage our lands. And very clearly, we did not want reserve lands sold. It's happened in the United States. Some of you may be familiar with some of those tribes in the United States in the early 1900s up to the present. Some of them in long past history sold off chunks or parts of their reserve. We said no. That cannot happen in Canada. And no, we would not go under provincial regime laws. It has to be something equal in power to the federal government, so that when a land code is passed, when the lawmaking decision begins, we needed to be sure that we had the right to be the decision makers, with no other minister, no other prime minister, or any other governmental body above us. The power has to rest with the people, with you as community members. This is where the decision making must take place. We know the history of the land. We know what's happened since the first Indian Act was put in place in the 1860s. We know what's happened and how much lands we've lost as peoples. These lands here, the Metlakatla, you have the most pristine lands perhaps anywhere in the world. You have the right to those lands. You have Aboriginal title and you have Aboriginal rights. What you need is a legal, full-blown decision-making to make your decision over your lands. And this is what this does. It provides that incremental self-government. It doesn't give you all of the self-government powers. Those are other matters that will have to be dealt with at other tables. They may include treaty, they may include self-government in other formats, like my community at West Bank, Tawasin, and some of the other communities, Flayaman. Those are other matters. But as far as the most important power, it has to concern lands and resources. And this is what this provides you. And government must pay for that. That was something that we negotiated. You're not borrowing monies to put together the land code. Government has agreed that this is so important that they must fund it. And that's a fiduciary responsibility. And that's something that's very, very significant. So with the interest that is happening now across Canada, it's proven successful. How do we know that? Well, not only have I been to the majority of the First Nations across this country with that interest in land management, but we hired some experts. We hired KPMG, one of the largest accounting firms, most prestigious ones in Canada, to do studies. And we did those studies. They did 2 significant studies. They're working on a 3rd. They did a study in 2009. They did a study in 2013. And we're looking for a further study to further fine-tune all of the data. From the initial 2 studies that they've done, that's written, that's been submitted to government, it's online, available to you, it's very, very clear that First Nations have benefited. And they've benefited significantly by having their own decision-making powers. As an example, one of the questions was, any of these communities that voted, did they make a mistake? Would they turn back the powers that they now have? The answer was resoundingly no. No one, no First Nation community would have the powers to do certain things, to manage, to protect their lands, and all of a sudden give that back to Indian Affairs, for them to take it back. The answer is no. Not one First Nation. And what about unemployment rates? What about jobs? What about economic opportunities? The study clearly shows, very clearly, that in some communities unemployment has been reduced, not only significantly, but something that's almost unheard of. One community had an unemployment rate of over 90% originally. After the Land Code and working with land management and so forth, they now have under 5% unemployment. That's a fact. We know that hundreds of millions of dollars are being injected by land developments, by opportunities, both to natives and non-natives alike. We know that somewhere between 7 times and 10 times the investment that Canada has made into the Land Management Initiative, Canada gets back. There is no program, there is no initiative that I'm aware of in Canada, in this whole country, that gives that type of return. I.e., let's say $10 million was put into an initiative, you get $100 million back as the government of Canada. Very significant. And that is why Canada wishes to continue to fund the work that's being done, fund the developmental costs, fund the operational costs. And it's a requirement. And it's something that we were able to negotiate and feel very pleased with, and know that what Canada has done by agreeing for us to manage our own lands, to have our rights recognized, we are giving a return back to the country. And that has impact nationally, it has impact provincially, territorially, it puts us in a different stead. We also know from the study, and by looking at First Nations across Canada, the social benefits are also improving. Economic and social are two different things. Economic concerns monies and land developments and things of that nature. Social involves jobs and opportunities. One of the biggest opportunities from a social perspective is youth. We know of the youth suicides that have happened from coast to coast in First Nation country. All of you, probably all of us, have been touched in one way or another by a suicide. And quite often those suicides are the youth. Why? Much of it is because they have no hope. They have no future. I think every community wants to have a future. The future is your children and your grandchildren and your children yet unborn. To provide that hope, you need to provide the opportunities that are going to be beneficial to them. And this is what's shown. These studies have shown that the return on the social impact is now here. That youth, particularly, because of jobs and opportunities and having hope, by having a community that can manage its own affairs, that this is something that's very, very significant. And that's worth, I think, much more than any economic opportunity. This I know of. I would give you, the council here will have a list of all of these operational First Nations that have passed land codes. And I would challenge and ask the councils and any of you who wish to have this list to phone any one of these First Nation communities, phone a number of them, and ask them, has this improved your lives? I know from the studies and from my meetings and sessions that it has. And that's why I'm proud to be associated with this. I do not work for government. That is, not outside First Nation governments. I work for the First Nation peoples. And I'm proud of that. And the communities I know are proud of what they're doing. And these are the things that are happening. So what you're considering now at Metlakatla is your right to control your lands. If you choose not to, then that's your decision. But you need to know the facts. If you choose not to, you will remain under the Indian Act. As an Indian Act delegate person or body, you will have no powers to make your laws. You can assert Aboriginal title, yes. When it comes to lawmaking, you are not recognized as a governmental body, even though you may assert it. Legally, you're not. You have, I believe, a tremendous opportunity before you right now to become recognized as full governmental bodies. The full power to make your laws, not as a delegate, not as bylaws. Bylaws is something that's subsidiary to another power above you. The Indian Act provides that. As an example, chiefs and councils throughout this country can do bylaws, and they can pass different bylaws that affect different aspects of your lives. But they have no force and effect unless the Department of Indian Affairs, the minister or his or her delegates allows it to be passed. And then it takes effect. The final decision-making rests not in your hands as a community, but in your councils, but in Ottawa and the BC region. If that is what you wish to continue to live with, then you live under the Indian Act. There will not be a change. So you have to consider, is that something that you feel safe and comfortable on? I can tell you about the history of First Nations across this country and how much lands have been expropriated. How many of us have been affected by those ancestors that have lost their status under the Indian Act, that no longer were considered Indians under the Indian Act, that evolved into the white society. We've all been impacted in one way or another. We've all lost lands through road rights of ways, hydro rights of ways, outright expropriations, improper governmental officials that were supposed to be looking after our lands and our people that took advantage of us. If that's what you want and that's what you trust, that's the past. That's what's happened, and no one can deny that. So the future is something that we must carefully consider. In one form or another, if that's what you want, you need to decide who you want to control your lands. Government, federally, provincially, municipally, other individuals, or is it you? You as a community, you as the rightful owners of these lands who have the Aboriginal right, that have the Aboriginal title, is it you that you trust over government? My answer is yes. And that's what I've heard from First Nations across this country. They trust themselves. So as a community, that's a big decision. Many have considered this, it's not for everyone, there's no question about that. There are some First Nations I've dealt with, and there are several that were unsuccessful in passing their land codes. The majority have been successful. The most recent successful one was our last community at Comox. You're all familiar with Courtenay and Vancouver Island and Comox. Comox just voted, just recently, 92% in favor of the land code. They're happy, they're pleased. We've had several communities in that 92 to 98% that have passed it. Some are 54%, 52%, 60%, 70%. It varies from community to community. There are some communities that feel that they're just not ready to look after the management of their lands. They're concerned. Do they have qualified people? Do they have the proper training? Some are fearful of that. Some are fearful because they don't trust their chiefs and their councils, their elected leaders, and some believe that all the power would rest with the councils that are elected by the people. I can tell you, one of the principles of the framework agreement is that power rests with you, the people. Your council, whoever they may be, elected from time to time, must take the direction of the people. And the land code provides that. It provides the accountability, the transparency. It provides you to be involved in the lawmaking, and not the councils, but you as the people of the final decision makers. These are things that were very clear when we looked at the inherent right, when we looked at Section 82, and we looked at the Constitution and all of that. These are things that we wanted to make sure that there was protection for you. Your land code has been drafted. You have seen copies of it. You know from that draft, hopefully you do, that you have the right to pass, to say whether a law is passed. And it's a requirement. Any elected council, from the day a land code is passed to the future, as long as that land code exists, must do that. Must seek the will of the people. Under the Indian Act, they don't have to do that. That's a fact. They can pass certain things without the vote of the people, but they cannot with the land code. So I can assure you, I've been to these thousands of meetings, and I've heard it from different communities throughout this country about those types of concerns and challenges. I can tell you that those who have gone ahead and passed their land codes feel good. My community, for example, not only passed a land code, but then went on to self-government. So now we're pretty much fully self-governing except for the settlement of our land claims. That's the next big challenge our community has. Some of the First Nations here in this province are dealing with treaty negotiations. That's another aspect. But beginning, in my opinion, and how I've considered it, is that to have the incremental self-government as a start is where most First Nations should proceed. Because it gives you something that you learn from that, and you will improve on that. I've seen communities that have passed land codes that didn't have all of the training, didn't have the trained land managers, but nonetheless felt that they needed to protect the lands that they have. Some of the northern communities, as an example, that have the forest resources said, look, we don't trust the Department of Indian Affairs. We trust our community. We want the power to make those decisions when they're needed and when we feel ready. And this is what some communities have done. We do not want governments to expropriate our lands. They cannot do so with the land code. They can do so with certain conditions with the Indian Act. And the examples are many arm lengths long across Canada as to what's occurred with First Nations. So this is something that's, I think, very, very significant. Now, what it doesn't do, it doesn't give you full control over fisheries. It doesn't give you the full control over intertidal resources. What it does give you control is any lands and any resources within reserve boundaries. I understand you have between 3,000 and 4,000 hectares of lands. All of those lands, you would have full decision-making, full authority. You would have the full authority to make environmental laws. If your lands are impacted by pollution or otherwise, you have the power to put environmental laws in place and to challenge provincial or federal laws if there is an impact in your communities. That's something you do not have under the Indian Act. Under the Indian Act, with environmental laws, you rely on the Department of Indian Affairs to make decisions for you. That's what you rely on. You rely on outside government. Not so with the land code. It gives you something that I think is very, very significant. What the land code doesn't do is to allow you to put atomic bombs or anything like that in place. Maybe that's a good thing. It doesn't give you the power to put migratory birds at risk because that's a federal treaty thing with the United States and Canada. But the bulk of all of the land management decisions would rest with you. A question was asked earlier today by some of the community members on the mainland, and that was, do you have control over water? The answer is yes. If it's within the reserve boundaries, you have control of that. You have impact. It gives you something that many First Nations across this country do not have when you're at negotiating tables. When you're at the negotiating table, there is no Indian Affairs agent, minister or otherwise, that's going to hold your hand or tell you what you can or cannot do, because you have the power to do so. And they cannot stop you from the decision making that you made. The responsibilities that are in the past wrongs that have occurred with Canada, provincial or otherwise, they still are held accountable, those outside governments. You do not give up specific claims, your land claims or Aboriginal title with a land code. They remain on the hook from a fiduciary and a legal perspective, trust and otherwise. So again, big decisions. And I know you're considering it, and you need to know the facts. What I'm giving you is the facts the best that I can. And I've certainly had the honor and certainly the pleasure to work with First Nation communities across this huge country. And I'm proud of the accomplishments. I've seen the benefits that have arisen. I've seen communities rise to levels that they've never seen before, and they continue to do so. And that is why I, as the chairman of the Lands Advisory Board across this country, receive calls very frequently from First Nations who are on the waiting list or who are considering it, saying, when can we have you make a presentation? Or when do you think we can have a chance to consider the developmental lawmaking process? And I receive that all the time. And I'm very proud of that. We're working as best we can with government to ensure that they find the dollars to make this happen. And we've been successful so far because there is no other initiative, as I indicated, that has proven that they get return on their investment up to 10 times. Now, so ladies and gentlemen, members of the Metlakatla, it's been an honor to speak to you this evening. I'm certainly so pleased to have the opportunity to meet many of you here, to have a tour of your lands, to understand the resources that you have, the beauty and the pristineness that exists in this community. I believe that every First Nation should envy you as the people of this land. And I'm certainly proud to be associated and to have this opportunity. So I thank my colleague, Leah George Wilson, for being involved, being a director with us, and for her knowledge. Her community has a land code in place. I thank Patty White, who is a resource person here on our resource board that assists you. We will do our best as a team, and we are backed up by other communities across this country. We share information very willingly. There are literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of legal documents and procedures and policies that are before you, that is available to you, to your committees, to your councils, any day you wish so. It's something we willingly share. We work together. We're working on some training programs right now and capacity building, and we're going to be making presentations soon to the federal government to get additional monies so that we can have the proper training that will make it easier as First Nations resume the land management jurisdiction. People of this land, Limlim, for allowing me here before you tonight. Right, Limlim.